I'm recording this at 5:17 a.m. from my study in Colorado, and I've been staring at satellite imagery of Russian military bases near the Iranian border for the past 4 hours. What I'm seeing should terrify anyone who understands how proxy wars escalate into direct superpower confrontations. Because while China just abandoned Iran with the cold efficiency of a Fortune 500 corporation, Russia is making exactly the opposite calculation. Putin is doubling down on Iranian support at precisely the moment when that support could trigger a direct military confrontation with the United States. But here's what makes this story truly dangerous. Russia isn't supporting Iran because they love the Islamic Republic or believe in Iranian ideology. They're supporting Iran because Putin has concluded that if America succeeds in destroying Iran through economic warfare, Russia will be next. What I'm about to explain reveals why Vladimir Putin, a man who spent 25 years avoiding direct military confrontation with America, might be preparing to risk everything to prevent Iranian regime collapse, and why that calculation could trigger the broader war that careful Chinese abandonment was designed to prevent. This is the story of how Russian desperation is turning Iranian chaos into a global crisis that threatens to spiral beyond anyone's control. The Moscow War Room. 3 days after China expelled Iran from BRICS naval exercises, something extraordinary happened in Moscow that reveals everything about Putin's strategic thinking. Sergei Shoigu, Putin's Security Council secretary and former defense minister, held a 40-minute phone call with Ali Larijani, Iran's National Security Council secretary. That call was monitored by every major intelligence service, and the readout was more revealing than anything Moscow has said publicly about Iran. According to Russian media, Shoigu condemned the latest attempt by foreign forces to interfere in Iran's internal affairs and expressed sympathy with Iran over the killing of a large number of citizens amid the unrest. But here's what makes that statement so significant. Shoigu didn't say American interference, he said foreign interference. That gives Russia diplomatic flexibility to avoid direct confrontation if Trump orders military strikes. More importantly, Shoigu's expression of sympathy for Iranian casualties represents the strongest Russian statement supporting any country facing American pressure since the Ukraine invasion began. Why would Putin authorize such explicit support for Iran when Russia is already fighting a war against American allies in Ukraine? Why risk expanding Russian conflicts when Russian military resources are already stretched thin? Because Putin has made a calculation that terrifies his own advisors. If America can strangle Iran economically and then remove their regime militarily without serious consequences, the same strategy becomes available for dealing with Russia. The Syria lesson? To understand Putin's Iran calculation, you have to understand what happened in Syria between 2024 and 2025 and why that collapse changed Russian strategic thinking fundamentally. For over a decade, Russia invested enormous resources supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime. Russian air power, Russian military advisors, Russian diplomatic protection, Russian economic support. Putin spent billions keeping Assad in power as proof that Russia could protect anti-American allies. Then in December 2024, Assad's regime collapsed in less than 2 weeks. Not because of American military action, not because of massive foreign invasion, but because Syrian economic collapse, popular uprising, and external pressure created conditions where Russian support became insufficient to maintain regime stability. Putin watched a client regime that he'd spent years protecting simply evaporate despite Russian military presence in the country. The lesson for Russian strategists was clear. If Russia can't protect allies from the combination of economic warfare, popular revolt, and external pressure, then Russian partnership becomes meaningless. Countries facing American pressure will seek accommodation with Washington rather than relying on Russian support that might prove insufficient when crisis occurs. This creates an existential challenge for Russian global influence. If Russia can't protect allies during their moments of maximum vulnerability, why would any country accept the risks of Russian partnership? Putin's support for Iran isn't really about Iran. It's about demonstrating Russian reliability as an alternative to American dominance. The Ukrainian constraint. But here's where Putin's Iran calculation becomes truly complex. Russia is already fighting a war that's consuming enormous military resources, economic capacity, and political attention. The Ukraine conflict has cost Russia an estimated $150 billion in direct military expenditures, $300 billion in economic sanctions impacts, and hundreds of thousands of military casualties. Russian defense production is operating at maximum capacity to supply Ukrainian operations. Russian military personnel are deployed across multiple fronts in eastern Ukraine. Russian economic resources are strained by wartime production requirements and sanctions evasion. Under normal circumstances, these constraints would make additional military commitments impossible. But Putin has concluded that the Iranian crisis isn't separate from the Ukrainian conflict. It's the same conflict expanded to a different theater. From Putin's perspective, American strategy in Iran and American strategy in Ukraine serve the same objective, demonstrating that countries challenging American global dominance will be systematically isolated, economically strangled, and ultimately destroyed. If America succeeds in Iran, Ukraine becomes irrelevant because Russian defeat in Iran proves that Russian power cannot protect anti-American regimes anywhere. This is why Putin is willing to risk additional military commitments despite Ukrainian constraints. Failure in Iran means failure everywhere. The arms delivery calculation. So what is Russia actually doing to support Iran? The answer reveals both the extent of Russian commitment and the limits of Russian capability. Over the past 6 months, Russia has quietly delivered approximately $2.3 billion worth of military equipment to Iran through complex third-party arrangements. A Spartak MRAP's 40 mine-resistant armored vehicles specifically designed for urban operations against internal threats. Electronic warfare systems, advanced jamming equipment that Iran used to disrupt Starlink satellite communications during their internet blackout. Air defense components, spare parts, and technical support for existing Iranian S-300 systems, though not complete new systems. Naval equipment, fast patrol boats, and coastal defense missiles through Syrian and Lebanese intermediaries. Intelligence support, real-time satellite imagery and communications intercepts about American military positioning in the Persian Gulf. But notice what's missing from that list. No advanced fighter aircraft, no ballistic missile systems, no nuclear technology, no direct Russian military personnel. Russia is providing Iran with defensive capabilities and internal security equipment, not offensive weapons that could directly threaten American forces or Israeli territory. This is calibrated support designed to help Iran survive American economic pressure and internal revolt, but not to escalate military confrontation beyond Russian control. The strategy reveals Putin's sophisticated understanding of escalation dynamics support Iran enough to demonstrate Russian reliability, but not enough to trigger American military retaliation against Russian assets. The Caspian Sea lifeline. The most important aspect of Russian support for Iran isn't weapons deliveries. It's the economic lifeline that Russia provides through Caspian Sea trade routes. Iran's economy is collapsing because American sanctions have cut them off from global financial systems and international markets. But Iran shares the Caspian Sea with Russia, which creates opportunities for sanctions evasion that don't exist with other trading partners. Russian and Iranian vessels can conduct commerce through Caspian ports without using international shipping routes monitored by American naval forces. Transactions can be processed through Russian banks that aren't directly connected to dollar-dominated financial systems. Most importantly, energy cooperation between Russia and Iran allows both countries to evade sanctions more effectively than either could manage independently. Here's how it works. Iran provides Russia with refined petroleum products that Russian refineries can't produce efficiently due to sanctions. Russia provides Iran with natural gas that Iranian power plants need to maintain electrical generation. Both countries use this energy swap to avoid international markets where American sanctions are most effective. The Caspian trade route isn't large enough to replace Iran's lost Chinese commerce, but it's sufficient to prevent complete economic collapse. Russian economic support gives Iran perhaps 6 to 9 months of additional survival time that they wouldn't have otherwise. From Putin's perspective, that additional time might be enough for Iranian regime to weather the current crisis or for American political pressure to force Trump to seek diplomatic solutions rather than military escalation. The intelligence sharing network. But the most dangerous aspect of Russian support for Iran is something that happens in secure facilities that never appear in satellite imagery. Intelligence sharing. Russia operates one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence collection networks, including satellite surveillance, electronic intercepts, and human intelligence operations throughout the Middle East. Over the past 2 months, Russia has been providing Iran with real-time intelligence about American military movements, Israeli operational planning, and European diplomatic communications related to Iranian sanctions. This intelligence sharing serves Russian interests in multiple ways. Tactical helps Iran avoid American and Israeli military operations, prolonging regime survival. Strategic demonstrates Russian capability to support allies against American intelligence advantages. Operational provides Russia with Iranian intelligence about American military capabilities and planning in the Persian Gulf region, but intelligence sharing also creates enormous escalation risks. If Iranian forces use Russian intelligence to attack American personnel, does that constitute a Russian attack on American forces? If Iranian operations succeed because of Russian intelligence support, how does America respond to Russian involvement? These questions become critical if Iranian desperation leads to attacks against American bases, Israeli targets, or commercial shipping in the Persian Gulf. Russian intelligence support might help Iran survive American pressure, but it also creates mechanisms for direct Russian-American military confrontation. The Wagner factor. Here's something that should terrify Pentagon planners. Russian private military companies are quietly establishing presence in countries that border Iran. The Wagner Group operations have essentially ended following Yevgeny Prigozhin's death, but new Russian private military organizations have emerged with different names and similar capabilities. These new organizations, operating under names like Patriot Media and Redut, have established training camps in Tajikistan, Armenia, and Iraq over the past 8 months. Officially, these operations are focused on counterterrorism training and border security support for host governments. Unofficially, they're positioning Russian military capabilities within striking distance of Iranian territory. The presence of Russian private military contractors in Iran's neighborhood serves multiple purposes. Deterrence signals to America that military action against Iran might trigger confrontation with Russian forces. Escalation control provides Putin with options for supporting Iran that don't require direct Russian military involvement. Intelligence creates Russian observation posts for monitoring American military preparations and Iranian regime stability. Contingency planning establishes Russian assets for potential intervention if Iranian regime collapse threatens regional stability. But private military companies create their own escalation dynamics. If American forces encounter Russian contractors during Iranian operations, combat becomes possible regardless of official policies from Moscow or Washington. The nuclear shadow. The most terrifying aspect of Russian support for Iran involves something that neither country discusses publicly: nuclear materials security. Iran currently possesses enough enriched uranium to build 10 nuclear weapons if they decide to weaponize their program. Iranian regime collapse could leave those materials unsecured, creating opportunities for nuclear terrorism that threatens global security. Russia has quietly offered Iran technical assistance for securing nuclear materials during political instability, not assistance for weapons development that would trigger immediate American military response, but assistance for preventing nuclear materials from falling into unauthorized hands. This nuclear security cooperation serves Russian interests in several ways. Stability prevents nuclear terrorism that could destabilize the entire Middle East region. Leverage gives Russia influence over Iranian nuclear decision-making. Intelligence provides Russia with detailed knowledge about Iranian nuclear capabilities. Deterrence signals to America that precipitous Iranian regime change could create nuclear security crises that require Russian cooperation to resolve. But nuclear cooperation also creates enormous risks for both countries. If Iran decides to accelerate weapons development using Russian technical assistance, America might target Russian nuclear personnel as enemy combatants. If Iranian nuclear materials become unsecured and Russia attempts to secure them, American forces might interpret Russian actions as nuclear proliferation rather than security cooperation. Nuclear dimensions of Russian-Iranian cooperation create scenarios where misunderstanding could trigger nuclear confrontation between Russia and America. The energy weapon. Putin's most powerful tool for supporting Iran doesn't involve military equipment or intelligence sharing, it involves global energy markets. Russia is the world's largest exporter of natural gas and second largest exporter of crude oil. Russian energy policy can influence global prices in ways that either help or hurt Iranian economic survival. Over the past 3 months, Russia has deliberately reduced energy exports to European markets, creating supply shortages that drive up global energy prices. Higher energy prices benefit Iran in several ways. Export revenue, Iranian oil sales generate more revenue per barrel, providing additional government resources. Economic pressure. Higher global energy costs create economic pressure on Western countries supporting Iranian sanctions. Political leverage. Energy price increases create domestic political pressure in Western countries for diplomatic solutions rather than continued sanctions. Russian energy manipulation isn't explicitly coordinated with Iran, but the timing suggests deliberate Russian strategy to support Iranian regime survival through market mechanisms. The danger is that energy market manipulation could trigger broader economic warfare between Russia and Western countries that extends far beyond Iranian issues. If Russia weaponizes energy exports to support Iran, Western countries might respond with sanctions against Russian energy sector that force Putin to choose between escalating economic warfare or abandoning Iranian support. The Moscow summit that never happened. 3 weeks ago, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was scheduled to visit Moscow for emergency consultations about American military threats and Chinese abandonment. The visit was quietly canceled at the last minute, officially due to scheduling conflicts. But according to my sources in European intelligence services, the real reason was more revealing about Russian strategy. Putin decided that public meetings with senior Iranian officials would signal Russian support that might trigger American retaliation before Russia is prepared for broader confrontation. Instead, Russian support for Iran is being coordinated through third-party intermediaries, private communications channels, and commercial arrangements that maintain official Russian deniability. Putin wants to support Iran enough to prevent regime collapse, but not enough to appear directly responsible for Iranian survival. This approach reflects sophisticated Russian understanding of escalation management, provides sufficient support to maintain credibility as an ally, but avoid obvious visibility that forces American response. The cancelled summit reveals Russian recognition that supporting Iran is dangerous enough to require careful management of international perceptions. The timeline pressure. But Putin faces the same timeline pressure that's driving Iranian desperation. American economic strangulation is working faster than Russian support can compensate. Iranian currency collapse, inflation crisis, and popular revolt are accelerating beyond Russian ability to stabilize through economic cooperation and military assistance. Russian support might extend Iranian regime survival by 6 to 9 months, but it can't prevent ultimate collapse unless Iranian economic fundamentals improve dramatically. And improving Iranian economic fundamentals requires either ending American sanctions or finding alternative export markets large enough to replace Western commerce. Russia can provide neither. Russian markets aren't large enough to absorb Iranian exports at levels required for economic stability. Russian financial systems can't replace Iranian access to global banking networks. Russian support for Iran is essentially buying time while hoping that American political pressure forces Trump to choose diplomatic solutions over continued economic warfare. But if American strategy is working as designed, time favors American objectives rather than Russian intervention. This creates incentives for Russian escalation as Iranian collapse approaches. If gradual Russian support is insufficient to prevent Iranian regime change, Putin might conclude that dramatic Russian intervention is necessary to avoid demonstration of Russian powerlessness. The Caucasus calculation. Russian support for Iran also involves calculations about regional influence that extend beyond Iranian regime survival. Iran borders Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, countries where Russian and American influence compete directly. Iranian regime collapse could create refugee flows, economic disruption, and political instability throughout the Caucasus region that affects Russian strategic interests. American military action against Iran might require overflight rights through Caucasus countries, creating pressure on those governments to choose between American requests and Russian objections. Post-conflict Iran might become an American client state that threatens Russian influence in Central Asia and the Caucasus through alternative energy export routes and security partnerships. Putin's support for Iran serves Russian regional interests beyond Iranian regime survival. But regional calculations also create additional escalation risks. If American operations against Iran require use of bases or airspace in countries that Russia considers within their sphere of influence, Russian response might target American facilities outside Iranian territory. Regional dimensions of Iranian crisis could expand military confrontation beyond Iranian borders into areas where Russian and American forces operate in closer proximity. The desperation dynamic. What makes Russian support for Iran truly dangerous is that it's being driven by Russian desperation rather than Russian strength. Putin isn't supporting Iran because Russia is confident about challenging American power globally. Putin is supporting Iran because Russian options for maintaining global influence are disappearing rapidly. Chinese abandonment of Iran demonstrates that Russia's primary ally won't risk economic welfare to support anti-American coalitions. Syrian regime collapse demonstrated that Russian military support can't prevent determined American pressure from achieving regime change. Ukrainian conflict has revealed limits of Russian military capabilities against Western-supported opponents. Russian support for Iran represents Putin's last opportunity to demonstrate that Russian partnership provides meaningful protection against American pressure. But desperation creates dangerous decision-making dynamics. Desperate actors take risks that rational actors would avoid. Desperate allies encourage desperate behavior from partners facing similar pressures. Russian desperation and Iranian desperation could create mutually reinforcing escalation dynamics that overwhelm careful strategic planning from both Moscow and Washington. The point of no return. I'm going to tell you something that keeps Russian strategists awake at night. Russia's support for Iran has probably already crossed the threshold that makes direct confrontation with American forces inevitable. Russian intelligence sharing with Iran, weapons deliveries to Iranian forces, and economic support for Iranian sanctions evasion constitute acts that America will interpret as hostile regardless of Russian intentions. When American military action against Iran begins, and my analysis suggests it will begin within 60 days, Russian assets will become legitimate targets if they're supporting Iranian resistance to American operations. Putin probably understands this, but he's concluded that allowing Iranian regime collapse without resistance would damage Russian credibility more than risking military confrontation with America. This is the classic security dilemma that leads to wars neither side wants, but both sides feel compelled to fight. In our next episode, we need to examine why Israeli military planning has shifted from surgical strikes to comprehensive campaign preparation, why American Special Operations Forces are conducting exercises in countries that border Iran, and why the nuclear timeline has become the controlling factor in all military decision-making. Because what happens when Russian desperation meets American determination, meets Iranian collapse, meets Israeli security concerns all at the same time? The answer will determine whether we're heading toward the largest Middle Eastern war since World War II or the most successful regime change operation in modern history. The countdown to confrontation just accelerated beyond anyone's ability to control.